Hello and welcome. How much should Britain risk in trying to secure Afghanistan? After the deaths of 8 British soldiers in one day, that question's inevitably on the mind of the British public and rising on the political agenda. On Tuesday, the government of Prime Minister Gordon Brown announced it's sending an additional 140 troops to Afghanistan to bolster a war that has seen the most soldiers killed since the Falklands War in 1982. Mr. Brown also pledged more helicopters and greater resources, but a recommendation from military chiefs to send an additional 2,000 troops was rejected, and the government has denied allegations that cost-cutting has influenced the decision. Britain now has around 9,000 troops in Afghanistan in the run-up to the presidential elections next month. The vast majority are in Helmand, a province that's in the south and been the focus of fighting against Taliban insurgents. While the spike in fatalities has fueled debate among lawmakers, it may not have had a negative impact on public perception of the mission. A new poll shows the British public support for the war remains firm, in fact stronger than 3 years ago. But the debate rages over how long the country's troops will remain in Afghanistan. On Tuesday, President Obama recognized the importance of the British involvement.
The issue in Afghanistan is not simply an American issue. It is a worldwide issue. And the vulnerabilities to terrorist attack in Europe are at least as high as they are here in the United States.
On today's show, we take a look at Britain's strategy in Afghanistan and ask, what can realistically be achieved in the latest surge? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room and you can take part, and do phone into the show if you want to. We'll take your calls. I'm joined by two experts on the subject. From our studios in London, we have Rory Stewart, the director of the Carr Centre for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University, and a former British diplomat and army officer who was awarded the Order of the British Empire in 2004. Mr. Stewart also served as chief executive of the Turquoise Mountain Foundation, an organisation that invests in the regeneration of Kabul. From Bristol, we have Amias Godfrey, an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, who also served as an officer, spending 7 years on operations in Northern Ireland and Bosnia, and most recently 2 tours of Iraq. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show. And Rory Stewart, if I could start with you and ask, how long do you think the British public will accept the death toll? It's now the highest, or higher than in Iraq, and the highest since the Falkland War.
I think the British public is surprisingly strongly behind this. The problem is that politicians need to convince the public that this is really in Britain's interests. The link between what we're doing in Afghanistan and protecting the United Kingdom from terrorism is far from clear. So the British public's support is strong, but the politicians need to explain this mission.
Rory, I wonder, what is the most persuasive argument the British government's put forward from your perspective?
I don't think they've put forward any persuasive arguments. I think they've confused state building, development, fighting the Taliban and fighting Al-Qaeda. In fact, there are so many different reasons being put forward by the British government at the moment that I'm beginning to think the answer is we're there, and they're almost inventing reasons to justify our presence.
Well, Amias Godfrey, I would welcome you in from Bristol as well and ask you, what impact is there on the effort in Afghanistan by virtue of the fact there's been an emerging split between the military, some of the military leadership and the British government on the policy, and, for example, the request for 2,000 plus troops and only a couple of hundred sent out there?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult continually for the military while there is this split. The military know full well from their long history of counterinsurgency operations that they can only really provide one half of the equation, and that is really the break in battle. They can clear and they can hold ground, but beyond that they're quite restricted, and often we're asking them to do stuff that really is beyond their remit, which is the reconstruction half of it, which Rory will know well. Really what we need to see is this more joined up approach across the government, of which the military is part of it. Effectively, we're asking the military to hold the bag for everyone else to come along and put in that reconstruction effort behind. But at the moment, it looks like for the last 6 years, the military have just been doing their part with very little supporting them.
Amias, I want to put to you a comment we got from our viewers, one of our viewers through our Facebook site. Malam Ibrahim Gumel wrote in saying, the problem with British, American and NATO policy in Afghanistan is there's no end game. Their troops are positioned to stay there forever. They should not be complaining of losses, as legally the Taliban have every right to resist their presence. How do you respond to that kind of comment?
Well, first of all, the Taliban are not Afghanis. The Taliban are as foreign to Afghanistan as the NATO forces are. The Taliban are not a tribe of Afghanistan. They are a movement, effectively. So it's a bit misguided of a statement in itself. I can assure you that as history shows, the British Empire has no interest in physically sitting in Afghanistan, and certainly NATO equally has no interest in occupying and holding Afghanistan. What their main concern is that it doesn't become a lawless state, or indeed the Taliban take over again, where it can foster an agenda, worldwide terrorist networks. And really that is the crux of the problem. It's once terrorism started being exported globally from Afghanistan, it could have been anywhere else, that NATO forces decided that they want to stop this.
Rory Stewart, how is Britain's policy in Afghanistan diverging from its NATO allies? We heard President Obama saying that, you know, this is a European war as well, not just one for the USA. But when it comes down to it, how much is Britain taking a different path from the others?
I think this is a fundamental question. The United States is basically hawkish and is emphasizing counterterrorism. The other continental European countries, France, Germany, and even to some extent countries like Holland, see this more as a development operation. They talk a lot about women's rights, they talk a lot about state building. Britain is in a very uncomfortable middle ground. On the one hand, the British population are much keener on the war than European populations. The vast majority of the German people, for example, don't want to be involved in Afghanistan at all. But on the other hand, the British government is much more cautious, privately I believe, than the American government. And the British government is beginning to wonder, I believe, whether they're really going to be able to get stability in Afghanistan. So when people say, why are 2,000 more British soldiers not being sent? We're in a very strange situation where the British newspapers, British public are demanding that more troops be sent to Afghanistan. The British government, which is very skeptical about the situation, is now beginning to resist that pressure.
Now, Rory, it's interesting what Amir said about the exporting of terrorism from Afghanistan. I wonder, you know, how long people will put up with this argument or put up with this justification that fighting in Afghanistan keeps Britain safer at home.
I think it's a very eccentric argument. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda are in Pakistan, not Afghanistan. And Pakistan is a state which is much wealthier, much more established than Afghanistan. This theory that there's somehow a necessary connection between a failed state and the export of terrorism.
What I said there.
Sorry, Amias, go ahead. I'll get you to respond in a second. I just wanted Rory to finish. Go on, go ahead, Amias. Go on.
Indeed, I'm not necessarily going down the route that we are keeping Britain's or Europe's or America's streets safe by fighting in Helmand. I was more discussing or bringing forward the concept that throughout the 90s, Al-Qaeda were allowed, under increasing hospice of the Taliban, to center themselves there, and throughout a series of terrorist attacks, the first attack on the World Trade Center, the attacks on the American embassies in Africa and against USS Cole, culminating in 9/11. That was the exportation of terrorism from a safe harbor, which effectively the Taliban provided them. And it seems that 9/11 was a step too far for the United States, and that's why they went in then. I'm
going to get back to Rory in a second, but Amias, let me ask you what mixed sort of message might be coming from the British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who was in the region not long ago. He was in Pakistan, saying he used the term crucible of terror, describing the border region with Pakistan. Now he's saying that Afghanistan is pretty much the center of security issues. So that really seems to be a mixed message. How is that affecting the effort to build security?
Well, this is a constant problem of the lack of direction and leadership from the top. Rory touched on it as sort of there are mixed messages of what they're achieving there, what they're supposed to achieve there, and what they're being asked to do on a daily basis. The military are not political. They do what they are told to by the government at the time. At the moment, they're being told to fight and fight very hard in Helmand, but there's only a limited amount they can do. They will continue to do the military actions there, but unless there's a real top-down approach to the British effort in Afghanistan, I have to say we are starting to see a bit of a rethink from the Obama administration, at least from their perspective, where they're putting a surge in place. They have a bit more direction of what they want to achieve, And that's really what Britain needs from its own government.
Let me quickly back to Rory. I'm sorry we had to interrupt you there, but let me get back on this thought of keeping Britain safe at home. To what degree do you think there is the danger that the continued action in Afghanistan only helps to fuel radicalism at home in Britain, where people feel they have a cause they can connect with? Those who might be disenchanted with their situation in Britain see something that they can connect with overseas.
The problem is deeper. The more we engage in these very surreal, unfocused, unjustified activities and start throwing out words like war on terror, failed states, the more we get dragged into Afghanistan, Pakistan. Of course, we've been dragged into Iraq, and now there's pressure even from people to intervene in Somalia or Yemen. The more this happens, the more suspicion will build up around the world, the more the legitimacy of the United States, the United Kingdom and its allies will be eroded. And ultimately, I think the less safe we will be. So certainly, a more prudent, more focused, more sensible approach, which would acknowledge that state building in Afghanistan has at best only an indirect connection to counterterrorism, would probably make us safer at home.
Well, gentlemen, many more questions for you both. We're going to pause briefly for a break here. As we do, let me remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. We're also taking a poll in our chat room where we're asking, with the current strategy, what do you see as the outcome of the war in Afghanistan? Let us know what you think, and we'll be right back.